Hi, my name's Justin Shelfon. I'm the founder here at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party patch management solution that integrates into Microsoft Configuration Manager and Intune. Prior to my current role, I was also a Premier Field Engineer at Microsoft supporting Config Manager. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at what a site server is within a Config Manager site, as well as how it compares to a site system, and really just kind of dig in deep into what are the different threads and functions the site server performs, just to give you a better understanding would be the goal of this video. So to get started, let's just take a quick look at the documentation page. So there's not a whole lot on the docs other than basically saying, hey, the site server, this is just where you originally install a config manager site. So the easiest way to understand what your site server is within your hierarchy, whether that's a CAS, primary or secondary site, is if you go into your servers and site system roles, you should see a type of a primary site. And if you look at the components installed, you're also going to see the site server role. So that's going to let you know, hey, this is the main site system role, and this is what hosts the primary config manager components and services that perform a lot of the core of the site. Now, if we look back at the docs, there's also these things called a site system. So this differs from the site server, where it could be any remote server that hosts any different site system roles within the site. So an example of a site system would be if we look back in our site, we can see that we have this additional server called sitesystem.contoso.local. We can see it saying it's a site system server, and we can see this one only has the site system component and it does not have a site server. So for example, we can see it's hosting a software update point, a service connection point, a management point, and a distribution point. So it doesn't have that primary site server role, and you can have a lot of different remote site systems, and they're primarily used to scale out your site. For example, if you have remote locations, a common one could be a software update point, and a distribution point that could be a remote site system server, which would not be the same as the site server, which would be the primary one within that site. So I think that's pretty good from a general perspective of what a site server is and what a site system server is. But now let's kind of dig into the functions of the primary site server as well as what it does. So if we look into services, the main thing that you're going to notice here is the SMS executive service. So on a site server, this is going to have different threads or components that run under that Windows service that performs different actions for the site. Another thing is on the site server, you're also going to have the site component manager service. This one's pretty big. This is actually going to be a separate service from the SMS executive, and it's the service that would handle installing any remote site systems. So for example, if you said, I want this remote server to be a site system that's a software update point, this is the service on the site server that would actually remotely connect to that server. It would copy the bits down for the software update point, and it would actually initiate the remote installation using WMI from that site server. So that's the SMS executive on our site server, so we can see we're currently on demo 3. Now, what you'll notice, we're going to jump over to site system, and that's going to be our remote site system that had that software update point. You're also going to notice that we have the SMS executive service there, but the big thing there is it's going to be different in the fact that it's not going to run all the same threads as the SMS executive on the site server. So let's go ahead and jump back to our site server. And a good way to visualize this, if you go into monitoring, let's go to system status and then component status. What we can do here is we can see the different components that are running on the different servers. So for example, we can see demo 3. These are a lot of different subcomponents running under the SMS executive service. And then we also have some components under site system. So what I'm going to do is go and click on Start, and then I'm going to open the Configuration Manager Service Manager. So what this will do, this will show us the different components or threads that are actually running under the executive service on our site server. So this will just take a moment to connect. Essentially what this is going to do is look at the registry on the different servers within your site, and it's going to show you which components are actually running. So while this loads, let's actually take a quick look at the registry and see if we can show you what is actually going on and what this tool is querying. So if we come over here and look at our components, let me just copy this reg key. I'll include this in the notes of the video as well, just for quick reference. So we're currently on our site server. Let's go ahead and open that up. And we can see all these different components that are running on the site server. So if we come and look at our SMS executive service and we open up the threads, we can see that these are the different threads under the SMS executive of the site server. So for example, we can see things like the different components that are responsible for discovery, right? We can see our CCM. So this would be the component that handles pushing out the client from the site server. And these are just the different threads that essentially make up the SMS executive service of the site server. Here, for example, is the rule engine log. So this would be the component on the site server that actually handles automatic deployment rule processing. If we come in and actually look at the location of that, you can also see the specific DLL on the site server that is actually running that component under the SMS executive. Okay, so let's see if this is loaded up. So we can now see if we look at our servers. If we open up demo 3, we can see that these are the different components or threads that are running under the executive service on the site server. So this is essentially the different components listed here. This is ultimately the site server and the tasks that are being performed within that site server, right? So for example, let's say that we wanted to go look at the WSUS configuration manager component or the WCM component. You can come in and you can query and you can see whether or not that thread is started. So we can see it's currently running. We can see it's a thread of the SMS executive service. Now this is querying the registry. So what we can do to actually show you what this is looking at, let me come back to my registry locations and let's go ahead and look under this threads. So here we go. So it looks like we're actually already in that key. So this is essentially querying. So let's look at that WSUS configuration manager or WCM component. And what we could actually do is if we were to come into this tool, we could choose this stop action. And what that would do, that would essentially stop that component within the site server under SMS executive. So for example, if we come in and look at our log files, we can go look at the WCM.log, and when we right-clicked and chose stop, what that essentially did is told that thread of the executive service to go ahead and stop. So that specific thread would be responsible, for example, for configuring remote WSUS servers or software update points within the site. So I'm kind of going over this to make sure that you guys understand, this is all running under a single service for the most of the task. But all of these services or that service has different threads that are responsible for different core actions within the site server. Now what I did is I went over to the documentation page for log files. So let me just include a quick link here and show you where I got this data. And this will also be in the notes of the video below. So what I did is I created an Excel document basically going over the site server. Anything that contains site server, I basically grab that and put into an Excel doc. And that's ultimately going to be the different components that make up what the core site server does. So I'll include this link for this Excel sheet just in case you want to download and take a look. Of course, you could check out the docs. That's going to be the most up-to-date version. But what I thought would be helpful in this video is to cover some of the core components that I would say are most commonly used for actions that would be performed from the site server. So for example, the items that are listed in bold here, these are the ones that I'm planning to cover, just a quick summary of each of these within this video. So for example, SCCM.log, this one is very common. This is going to be the component that actually records any client push. Collection Evaluator, this would also be on the site server. This would be whenever collections are being updated. This would be the component on the site server that's responsible for doing the updates of those dynamic collections, for example. Distmgr, that would be where you can see different packages and application content whenever it's being updated on DPs. Package Transfer Manager, that's where you could actually see the binary content for apps, updates, really any package content going out to remote distribution points that would be facilitated from the site server within the content library. Sitecomp, this is going to be a big one. This is going to be whenever you install a remote site system, this is the component on the site server that is actually going to go out and connect to that remote server, make sure that the site server has admin rights on that server, and actually initiate the installation of any components for that remote site system. So these are kind of some of the things, just to give you a structure of what we're going to be looking at, that I want to cover within this, because this is going to be ultimately the task that the site server performs. Now, one thing that I do want to note is I did enable verbose logging as well as debug logging on my site server. The idea was that we could get a little more info in the logs as we go through these different components. So just be aware that if you don't see the same level of logging within your site, it's likely because we have verbose logging. So the way that we turn on verbose or debug logging within a component is on your site server within Software Microsoft SMS Tracing. We look over here. Each of these components have a couple of different things here. So what we set, by default, debug logging would be 0, meaning it's off. We went ahead and set that to 1. And we also changed the logging level from 1, which is normal, to 0, which is verbose logging. So we do have some additional logging on here that would make the logs that we look at today quite a bit more verbose. So we did that for every single component that is running under the site server. So what we ultimately did, we ran a PowerShell script that just looped through these keys. This is something that Cody, an engineer on our team, created. I'll probably make this available, but just be aware, if you do enable verbose and debug logging, these logs can grow quite quickly, and in most cases, it's going to be a lot more info that you need. Generally, if you're troubleshooting, you would probably only want to enable verbose and debug logging on the specific component that you're troubleshooting, right? So if WSync Manager was having issues, you would probably only want to enable debug and verbose logging, on that specific component. And once you're done troubleshooting, you would probably turn that back off so that you don't have those logs writing so frequently, causing things like disk I/O to be excessive. Okay, and then last thing, I guess just to mention before we dig in, we're not going to be looking at every component that makes up the site server. So there are going to be a lot of functions that we're not covering today, but I think I am covering some of the core ones that would be most common from a day-to-day perspective, where you may be troubleshooting different configurations of the site server that may not be working as intended, for example. So first thing, let's take a look, is discovery data. So the site server would be responsible for performing any type of discovery. So for example, if we come over here, and let's go ahead and open up our log folder, because this is going to be ultimately where the actions are taking place, would be here. So let's say, for example, we already have system discovery enabled. So that's going to be where your site server can go query different OUs within AD, and it can discover computers, right? So let's say, for example, we wanted to kick this in. So the log file for the component of the site server here would be adsysdis.log. So this guy right here, I think that's actually group discovery, AD system group, adsysdis.log. Okay, I think it's this guy here. All right, so here we go. So we can see that we have the adsysdis.log. So when I went and click run discovery now, you can see it actually kicked in that component, and then it started to query either the OUs or the containers that I had set to discover. So this, for example, this would be a component of the site server that would be responsible for covering or discovering any devices that you may potentially want to push the client to. Now, a lot of the actions that get performed within the site server, so for example, we can see a DDR, so that's a data discovery record. So any record that we discover, like a computer object, that would be considered a DDR. So a lot of the tasks that the site server performs, these different components, they use what's called an inbox within ConfigMgr. So if I were to come in and let's say I want to go look at the inboxes, there's a lot of different inboxes for these different threads that run under the component. So for example, we can see that for discovery, the inbox that was used was auth, and then DDM, I believe, DDR, so ddm.box. So whenever a record gets discovered with an Active Directory, it would put a file into here. In this inbox, this would tell the component to actually process that data discovery record, and then it would ultimately write that client record into the database. So for example, we can see that a machine called demo1 was discovered from Active Directory. We can see the different properties that we discovered, like the IP address of it. And if that machine didn't already exist, that component would drop it into the inbox, and then the component monitoring the files within that inbox would then process it into the database. So we'll actually see this a little bit more once we start talking about the hardware inventory component, and we can actually see some of this happening in real time. Now, one thing that you may have noticed, like that log file, it did take quite a while to load. So that's because I have that verbose and debug logging. So let me see if I can just kind of clear up the existing logs here, just so it doesn't take so long to load. So kind of same thing here. Let's say that you wanted to run a user discovery. So that's going to also be a component running under the site server. We should see it kick in a second. It's going to be adusrdis.log. So once that thread kicks in, we should see that log file get created here in a second. There we go. So we can see adusrdis kick in here. And since we deleted the log before, and since we have verbose and debug, you can see that this actually just kicked in just right now. So this is from running that discovery in a relatively small lab. We can see that due to that debug and verbose logging, there's actually a ton of content going on here, even in this small lab. So for example, we can see that when that component kicked in, we can see the verbose logging. It gives us a lot more detail. Like for example, we can see we discovered a user called Cody Mathis. We can see the OU that he's in, and just a lot of different data within that logging level. So this would be the component involved in discovering users. So if you wanted to deploy to users, you'd have to make sure they're discovered. And then kind of same thing here. If I wanted to run a group discovery, we'll see the SG, which system group discovery, kick in here in a second as well. There we go. We can see adsysdis. So that's the log that would be discovering the different groups that I want to detect. So within that component, you can see all the groups that are being discovered here, and that would be another thread of the executive service on the site server, and that would be its sole responsibility is discovering groups and writing that into the database, which you can then see within your ConfigMgr console. For example, if we came over here and looked at the user collections or device collections, you could populate groups under the criteria that you wanted to query here. All right, so the next big one, CCM.log. So this one's a pretty common one that if you're doing any type of client push, you're probably already quite familiar with this log file. So for example, let's say that you wanted to push the client to a device that was discovered. So in my case, I'm just going to choose one that I've already got running. And let's say I just wanted to reinstall the client. Whether or not it's a new install, like client equals no or client equals yes, and you're just reinstalling it, the process would be exactly the same from this perspective. So let's just say I want to always install it. I want to install it for this site that I'm on. So when we kick that in, what we're going to see, and this will probably happen too quick, is there's going to be a file that gets dropped in the CCM inbox. And then this component will discover that, and it will know the computer name based on that discovery, and we'll see it actually trying to connect and install the client on that machine. So we can actually see this all happening now. So let's just see what we got going on here. So here's where we can see the inbox. So when we went in and we said we want to install the client, it created a new file and it dropped it in that inbox on the site server, and this component detected, hey, there's a new file in here. I need to go push the client to something. So then we can see it found from that file the computer account that we wanted to install it from. And then this component on the site server would then reach out and it would try to connect to the admin$, which is the C Windows directory. This is why the site server, unless you're using a connection account, would need to have local administrator rights on the machine for this remote push, and it's also why you would need to have the WMI port so that it could remotely execute processes. So for example, we can see the site server then started to copy CCM setup to that remote machine, and then it essentially executed the CCM setup on that device. So if we were to go over to the Demo 3 client, let's take a look here. There's probably a good chance that we're going to see CCM setup running on this device. And that was essentially initiated from the site server from the CCM component. So if you ever had machines that were failing to get client push, common reasons could be firewalls, maybe DNS issues. The component on the site server that you would monitor would be that SCCM.log, because that's going to be the client component involved in client push. All right, next one we'll look at is Collection Evaluator. So let's go over to our device collections. We do have a couple here. So whenever a collection updates, whether it's from a scheduled, so if you have like a daily schedule for it to evaluate, or weekly or something like that, or whether you come in here and click Update Membership, colleval on the site server is going to be the component that is actually responsible for checking the different queries and collection evaluations to see whether or not there's any new devices that meet the thresholds. So for example, we can see when I went and clicked in to update the membership, we can see that a file got dropped into the colleval.box within that inboxes folder. And then we can see it actually evaluating. So for example, we can see that this collection here for 0015, we can see it took about 1/10 of a second or so to update based on the query that we had. So if we go and find 015, I'm just curious what collection that would be. This one right here. So that collection took, less than 1/10 of a second to update. So this is where, if you do have a ton of collections, if you have a lot of devices and you're using things like complex queries, you're often going to find, like if you did get into a state where collections were sitting here spinning for a long time, this would be the log file that you would essentially evaluate to see whether or not there's any problematic collection. So maybe you have a very complex query rule that is not optimized very well. Sometimes certain collections that are running very SQL intensive queries could cause some holdups in other collections evaluating. So one tool that you can use is colleval viewer. It's a tool available from, I think it's actually in the tools folder natively in recent builds of ConfigMgr. Let's just take a look and just see if that's actually here. I think it's server tools. Here we go. Yeah, so CE viewer, this is where you can view collection evaluators. So a lot of what this is going to do is connect to the database and show different collections evaluating. But essentially, it's going to be a lot of what colleval is doing in the background is going to be the type of data that you see here. So, if you did have issues where you have collections maybe very aggressive from an evaluation perspective, you're probably going to get very familiar with the colleval on the site server for monitoring anything that you could potentially optimize. All right, next one, let's take a look at the data loader component. So if we come back to our log files, this one can actually be somewhat problematic. If you're in a large environment, you're probably going to be pretty familiar with the data loader log. So this component on the site server is responsible for processing hardware inventory into the database. So for example, maybe if you had a very aggressive hardware inventory cycle, just maybe you didn't understand how it actually worked. Maybe you had it every hour or so. I've seen all kinds of different configurations when I was a PFE where, people may have hardware inventory running like every couple minutes, for example. And if you have a lot of devices, that can put a lot of stress on the database. And particularly the component that would be involved in processing all the inventory would be dataldr.log. So let's do this. Let's actually come into our registry. And we're going to go look at the data loader component. Let's see if I can find that one here. Here we go. So data discovery manager. So what I'm going to do, let's come back. I'm actually in the wrong key here. Let's go back to our components. Here we go, Data Discovery Manager. So in this key under Components, SMS Executive, and Threads, I'm going to say I want the requested operation to be stop. So what that's going to do, that's going to stop that component that's running under the executive. So for example, this is essentially the same thing as if I were to come into the Discovery Data Manager, and if I click Query, this just takes a second to load up. We can see that's now stopped, but that registry key was essentially the same as me coming in here and clicking stop. It's going to stop that component, which is ultimately going to be processing hardware inventory. So what I'm going to do over here on this client, hopefully it's done installing, it looks like it is I'm going to initiate a hardware inventory cycle. And what we're going to see here on the client side is the inventory agent's going to kick in. And then it's going to start processing hardware inventory, which is essentially looking at things like add and remove programs, things like system memory, hardware, pretty much anything that you see if you come into your device. And if you right click and show Resource Explorer, let's just take a look. Start Resource Explorer. Anything that you're looking at here would be coming from hardware inventory, right? So installed applications, looking at the disk data, all the hardware details you get here. Even though it's kind of confusing, some people, you may think that it's like software inventory, but that's totally different. The installed applications actually comes from hardware inventory. So what's going to happen, this is going to process the inventory file, XML. We can see that it then got sent up to our management point on the client side. We can see it got sent up. And then what's going to happen, let's go ahead and look at our site server. If we look back at our inboxes, under the auth folder and then the ddm.log, let's just see if we can find this coming in a second. And then we can see it looks like I actually stopped the wrong component. We can see that it did process that hardware inventory file that got in the dataloader.box. Let me just try to close out the data loader process as well. So I'm just going to set that to stop. Just take a look here. Okay, so that's the component that I actually wanted to stop. So let's go ahead and trigger another hardware inventory cycle on the client side. And what we'll see is we can attempt to see like when this hardware inventory file gets sent up to the site server. If that component is stopped, we should be able to actually see the file within the inbox on the site server because the component that processes that on the site server into the database, we actually stopped it. So we'll take a look, give that some time, and come back. All right, here we go. So now that that process is actually stopped, we can see we actually have the MIF file. So this is the format of file for hardware inventory. So for example, we can actually see some of this data in clear text when it gets sent up. So we can see that showing up here. We can see all the different inventory files like the programs and things like that. So what will happen now if I go in and start that component, so let's make it a start, that's going to start up the inventory loader. We can see that it detected that MIF file that was waiting to be processed. Ultimately, what happens when it processes it, it moves it from the dataloader.box on the site server, and then it moves it into the process folder for dataloader.box. And then that's going to be what ultimately is going to have that component process those values into the database. And then that's going to be what you actually then see within Resource Explorer because that's going to be looking at the database. But that's the data loader component, and that's essentially the responsibility would be for processing hardware inventory files. So we can see that this one right here, this one actually just got processed when we started up that component. All right, so next up, let's take a look at distmgr and then PkgXferMgr. So these two are going to be pretty big ones that you'll probably be troubleshooting if you're in ConfigMgr admin quite a bit. So if you ever have like a package that's stuck like in processing or something like that, there's a good chance that Data Transfer Manager or distmgr and PkgXferMgr, these are probably going to be the logs that you look at. So I'm going to go ahead and open both of these, and I'm going to go ahead and merge them. So what I'm going to do to actually kick this off is we don't currently have any applications or things that we could distribute in here today. So I'm just going to quickly create a new app just using our service over here on the site system. So under ConfigMgr apps, I'm just going to say I want Google Chrome, apply that. Now the content distribution, what we're going to do is within our Patch My PC tool, we're telling any new apps to go to the all distribution point. group. So what's going to ultimately happen, let me go ahead and run a sync. When this application goes out and we create it, it's going to automatically put it out to the distribution points. And that's going to be where we can see it actually getting processed here in a second. So we can see it's now creating the app in SCCM. You can see it downloading the content. But this is the big thing that comes into play. It's going to be where the package source is, because this is where PkgXferMgr is actually going to get the content. So we can see it just created the app. If I come back in and refresh, I can see I have patched my Google Chrome from our tool, and we can see it's pending. So what that means is here in a second, once the inbox for distmgr gets the file that we then distributed it, we should see a lot of things kind of kicking in here within this log. There we go. So we can see, let me just pause it for a second to see what's going on. So here we can see it picked up the new content file that we detected we need to distribute. Taking a snapshot. So this is a big piece of what's going to be happening here. Whenever you have a new app or software update deployment package, the distmgr is going to take a snapshot of the source folder, and this is going to be what goes into the content library. So on your site server, this is also one of the really key components of the site server, is there's this thing called the content library. So that's going to exist here. And this is where all the files that you have within applications, packages, software update content, pretty much any binaries that you have that you're distributing, they all get stored in the content library on the site server first. And then if you have remote distribution points, it would be the PkgXferMgr that actually grabs it from the content library on the site server and then distributes it. Now there's a few exceptions there. If you did have pooled distribution points, for example, it could potentially pull it from another distribution point that has the content already. But basically what we can see here is it took the snapshot. Here's where it actually processed some policy in here. Let's go ahead and unpause this for a second. Go. So this is where we can see that since we had the all distribution points group, we can see it starting to distribute it to that remote distribution point because that was part of that group. We can see things happening here. And this is the big piece for PkgXferMgr. So this is the other component, and this is what actually copies the binary files from the site server content library into the remote distribution point. So we can see it actually writing the bits into here, and this is pretty verbose. I don't know if you would see this level of content for each individual byte that we're writing if you have normal logging on. So you can see it then sent all the files. So this one here that's 65 meg, there's probably a good chance that if we look at the content here, that's probably the Google Chrome MSI. I think that's about the same size. Yep, so right about 70 meg or so. So that piece right there is likely the MSI. So you can see just a lot of things going on. So if you ever had like apps or packages that were showing up as failed or in progress, there's a good chance that you'd be looking at both the distmgr.log as well as the PkgXferMgr. And both of these components would be on the site server, and they would be responsible for pushing that content out remotely. Okay, hman is also a big one. So let's come back to our log files and find that one. So hman, let's open that up. So this component is responsible for publishing site configurations to Active Directory. So for example, things like boundaries and boundary groups, this would be the component that would actually publish them into AD, and that's what clients could look at to actually get that type of data. So let's just make, let's just see if we can actually get this component to do something here. Okay, let's just see if we do that. And let's try to add it to a boundary group. Let's just see if this hman actually picks up and starts publishing any of this site data that we added to Active Directory. Yep, so we can see the component. So just a couple seconds ago, we can see that it updated different information in Active Directory. So this would be essentially writing to that system management container. You can learn more about that in the setup video that I did, the first video in this guide of series. That basically talks about how the system management container works in Active Directory and how that gets written to. But this is essentially the component that's going to write the boundary group data to let clients know about different config manager sites if you're using an automatic client push and just letting it look to AD to determine what site it should be a part of. All right, so the next one, this is probably one of the more common logs that I would look at when I was a PFE, would be the sitecomp.log. So one thing to note about the site comp or site component manager, this is actually not a thread of SMS executive. So this is actually running its own Windows service, and this component is purely responsible for installing remote site system details and checking remote site systems. So for example, to actually have this log file kick in, let's go look at sitecomp.log. All right, so let's take a look and let's just see if we have any roles that we can add to this remote site system. So let's go ahead and do add, just see if we can find something that would be interesting to add here. Okay, let's just do a fallback status point. That should be a pretty basic one. I don't think I'm going to need a lot of configurations for that. And then we'll do next here. So when we went and said we want to add this new role on this remote site system, what's ultimately going to happen is the site system or site comp component, we can see it kicking in here. So we can see in the site control.box, we detected a new file. And this component's going to kick in and it's going to say, hey, somebody went in and they added a new site system role to a remote site system. So for example, let's just kind of look through this log. This is where we can see that it's connecting to the admin $ of the remote server. So a lot of times on that remote site system, let's go ahead and look in, get local users and groups. A common error that you might see in site comp is if you didn't have the site server computer as local admin, or if you didn't have the WMI ports enabled, you would often see errors in this log that says something like failing to connect. So what we're going to see is it should copy some binaries over to that remote site system. And we're just getting a ton of data here. So here's where we can start to see it connected to C$ SMS. It's copying a couple of different files in here, like this guy here. So this is likely one of the binaries that starts the role. Here's the role setup. So it's going to copy the role setup.exe over there. So if we actually remote in and we look at that site system, we should see the SMS folder on the root of C, it looks like, for this device. And this is where we can actually see a lot of the data that's being copied remotely from the site server. So let's just see if we can find where it actually kicks off the setup here. So here's where it's installing some prerequisites if needed. And this is where it's actually triggering the remote install on the site system. So we can see that it's running SMS bin x64 role setup, and then it's got a parameter of SMS FSP for the fallback status point. So if we were to come over to there and we look at bin x64 role setup, this is essentially the binary that got copied and executed from the site server to that remote site system that told it to install the fallback status point. Now, if we come back into our logs, we can see the fspmsi.log. So this is the fallback status point. This is the actual log file that's getting installed from sitecomp that triggered it on the site server that's being installed on this remote site system. So for example, if you ever had like a site system role fell, you would probably be looking at the actual logs from that remote server on that machine. Okay. And that's a good amount of some of the core things going on here. There are a couple of other pretty common components that I had highlighted here. So things like statesys, this would be responsible for processing state messages, which would be things like software update compliance would come via state messages. So statesys can definitely be a good log file to kind of monitor, like if you ever see machines maybe not reporting in update compliance. Sometimes if that gets too overloaded, you may see some errors in the statesys.log. So that's another big one. primarily around software updates and processing state messages that come back from clients. So that can be a good thing to know about, just some of the basics, get familiar with that log file. But outside of that, I think that covers a lot of the big ones that I wanted to talk about. The SMS provider, this one's pretty common. For most environments, the SMS provider is generally installed on the site server, but that's not a requirement. So for example, within our lab, just because it was already set up like this, the SMS provider is in fact on our site server, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. You could set up a provider on a remote site system. And then the only other component that we did have that could potentially be remote here is the site system database. So I won't go too deep into that because they're not necessarily required to be on the site server, but the provider generally is, and that's basically anything that you do in the console, that's going to be going through the provider, which essentially talks to the database. So, if we come in here and we look at the properties of this application, we're going to see that log gets quite busy, and it's going to be showing what's happening in the console and how that's interacting with the database when we go and click different options. So it's usually on the site server, definitely a good one to know about, but doesn't necessarily have to be. Sometimes for large environments, they might try to offload the provider into a remote site system just dedicated for that, for example. Okay, and then probably the other common ones that would be on the site server are things like WCM.log. So the WCM component, this is responsible for connecting to your software update points to configure WSUS on them. So let's just see if we can kind of make this one kick in for a second. So let's just do stop. So we can see that then shut down. And if we go ahead and start it, oh, that's not it. Start. We can see it kicked in. Now in our case, we only have one software update point. So if we look in our site, we can see that our remote site system is running that SUP. So if there were ever issues like maybe the WSUS server was offline, for example, this is the log file that you would actually see a lot of errors in. So let's just try to simulate an issue, for example. I'm going to go ahead and power down the site system. So that's the one running our software update point or WSUS component essentially. So if I were to come in and let's go ahead and stop that again just to make this happen faster. Usually I think it's every hour it goes and tries to connect. Let's start it back up. What we're likely going to see now is it's going to fail to connect to that remote server here in a second. There we go. So we can see when we started that component back up, that WCM on the site server was unable to configure or connect to that remote WSUS server because it's now turned off. So this is a pretty common log where if you are having issues where your WSUS servers may be unhealthy, maybe the service is stopped, maybe IIS is broken, maybe the servers are off, you're likely going to see this component on your site server have a lot of errors in it. So if we go ahead and stop that now that we're powering it back up, start it again, as long as that server's had time to boot up, we should see that it now connects successfully. So we can see that it is currently pending the config, but we didn't get any errors so far. And another one, there we go. So we can see it successfully connected now. So this is a pretty common one. Another one around updates is the wsync.mgr.log. Now, even if your software update point is on a remote WSUS server, when you come in here and do something like trigger a software update point sync, the component that actually monitors the process, even of those remote SUPs, is going to be the wsync.mgr component. So we can see that it was woken up by an inbox drop. So basically when I click sync now, that dropped a file into the inboxes on the site server under the wsync.mgr box that actually said, hey, I need to go trigger a software update point sync. And here in a second, we'll actually see in the wsync.mgr.log, we'll see the status of that kick in. So it's currently going to be pending for that WCM configuration. So it's going to take 1 minute whenever it connects in before it can actually run a sync, just because we started up that thread WCM. So once that kicks in that 1 minute, we should see it go away. And then we should also see wsync.mgr start to trigger a sync for WSUS to Windows updates, for example. There we go. So we can see the config completed, and right at that time, once it was done configuring it, it then said, hey, I can go ahead and sync my updates for that WSUS server. Now, within the actual remote site system running WSUS, there is a couple of logs that will also be running. Oh, looks like I'm on the client. Let me connect into site system. There we go. And on the remote site system, there's a couple of log files that you'll see kind of related to WSUS. So under logs, you can see WSUS control. That just kind of checks to make sure that the ConfigMgr component running the software update point can connect successfully to the local WSUS server. So from an admin perspective, you're probably looking less at this log as well as the sub setup, which will just show the software update being installed. Probably most of your time will be on the site server and actually looking at either WCM and or WSyncMgr, because that's going to be kind of the health of those remote software update points, especially if there's multiple. That's where you're going to see all that going on. All right, so I think that really covers most of the big ones that I wanted to look at today. So there's definitely some components that I didn't cover. So this was not an all-encompassing video of, hey, this is every specific thing that the site server does. But hopefully with this video, you can kind of understand how these different threads run under the executive service. And you know, hey, if I want to go learn more about what these different components are doing under the executive service on the site server, I can at least go into the documentation. I can get some basic descriptions of that. And I know where the log files are and how to kind of dig in to see what's going on the back end when that site server is performing different actions, either to the database or whether it's CCM pushing the client out to remote systems. Hopefully it just helps you understand kind of what that core site server is doing within a site. And hopefully it was helpful, and want to thank you for watching.